And welcome back. Thank you so much to all of you who have shared in our morning panels to learn more about some of the specific ways that women, especially as political candidates and as healthcare providers, are forging the way towards presenting a better and more positive future. We continue that today with thinking a bit more about how to strategize towards change. While 2020 marks the celebratory occasions of suffrage and the Women's Place anniversary, we recognize that the work of achieving gender equity is not yet done at the university or throughout our nation. We've moved forward, but not without an awareness of the challenges, the sacrifices, the triumphs of those who have gone before us and those who continue to walk alongside us. Building on the protests from this summer, protests for racial justice and for visibility, for representation and for safety, we can create feminist futures from a vantage point of righteous indignation about inadequate social, economic, and political conditions. Notably, the hashtag and organizing associated with Black Lives Matter were originated by three Black women, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi. However, women are less likely to be publicized as the victims of state injustice. Through campaigns such as the hashtag Say Her Name, through the African American Policy Forum, we can bring attention to Black women's protection and the long history of all women and their allies who have been resisting infringement on women's rights and safety. So perhaps like many of you, over the past several months, I have shared emotions that are as common today as they were at the time of the founding of the Women's Place. I've had a sense of hope tinged with anger and a willingness for those two to work together in pushing me towards action. Recently, Brittany Cooper was reflecting on her book, Eloquent Rage, about how rage might indeed be her superpower as a Black feminist. And I appreciated her language of thinking about anger as what she calls a kind of clarifying rage that helps build structures that don't keep reproducing that rage. And so it is with thinking about that concept of anger and its revolutionary power that we are pleased today to be able to welcome Rebecca Traister. Rebecca Traister is a writer at large for New York Magazine and a National Magazine Award winner. She has contributed to venues including The Nation, New York Times, and The Washington Post. She's the author of 3 books. Her first book, Big Girls Don't Cry, The Election That Changed Everything for American Women, traces the 2008 election. Traister proposes, though a presidential election is by definition a political event, the cultural shifts made visible and made possible in 2008 took place well beyond the scope of presidential history. Traister again turns to scenes of electoral politics and organizing in her second book, All the Single Ladies, Unmarried Women and the Rise of an Independent Nation. My own current research focuses on the lives and literature of single Black women in the first half of the 20th century. So I personally have appreciated the way that this book challenges stereotypes of single women as a problem population. Instead, this book emphasizes the trajectory of single women's centrality in social activism. All the Single Ladies concludes with a call for public policies that will better support single individuals, including single parents and child-free people. For example, Traister notes, we need to support alternative family structures, including cohabitating friends, people who live on their own and in clusters, people who parent with partners and without. Now, in Good and Mad, The Revolutionary Power of Women's Anger, Traister again challenges the pejorative assumptions that women are too emotional by instead elucidating anger as a generative sentiment for feminist progress. Written on the heels of the 2016 presidential election, Good and Mad surveys the long history of women's organizing and highlights how contemporary women's anger fueled the #MeToo moment, the Women's March, and public displays of dissent and assertion, culminating in many women announcing their candidacy for public office for the first time. Taken together, Traister's works highlight the appeal and power of women's political voices, both in history and in the current moment. With an eye to history, current events, and the discursive power of social media, Traister foregrounds how generations of women have mobilized for change and have now become an important sector of the electorate, one that politicians and other leaders cannot afford to ignore. Please join me in welcoming Rebecca Traister.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was a wonderful introduction. I'm so happy to be here, even virtually. I want to encourage you, as I would if we were in a room and I was at a mic, to interrupt me if you have any trouble hearing me. I can always put in unattractive headphones and try to make the sound better. I'm so pleased to be here today. I'm going to start today actually by telling the story of how I came to write the book Good and Mad that Andrea just described. It was almost 4 years ago now, this book about the social and political consequence of women's anger, because I think that story actually tells you something about how ingrained our ideas about women's anger are, and also how swiftly they can change. So I have been a feminist journalist for more than 15 years at this point, which means that my work has been writing critically about gender inequality, racism, and economic inequity. I've written about the movements to expand liberty, the labor and abolition and suffrage and civil rights and reproductive rights and justice movements. And as a journalist, I report on the efforts to roll back all the victories won by those movements, which means that you have to be angry in order to do the work that I do, in order to write the kind of stories that I write. But I also live in the world, which means that for years, I worked to make the rage that guided my work appear palatable to the general public. I, like millions of other women, had absorbed the messaging that open anger was needlessly overdramatic and unattractive, that it would in fact undermine my message. So in my writing, I took pains to be funny, playful, cheeky, ironic. I worked to make it clear that I am a fun person who enjoys friends, beer, and laughter, because to full-throatedly express the ire that motivated me would have been alienating and tactically unsound. And then I found myself in the wake of the 2016 election. Now, as a journalist, I had covered Hillary Clinton's campaign for the presidency, and so I hope many of you will understand what I say when I tell you that in those weeks and months following the 2016 election, I was simultaneously unsurprised that Clinton had lost and shocked to the point of paralysis that Donald Trump had won. In the very last week of 2016, and that break between Christmas and New Year's, I was on a walk with my husband and I was trying to figure out what my work and responsibilities were moving forward. As a feminist journalist, as a white woman who is part of the demographic that helped to elect Donald Trump to the White House, what was my work moving forward? And I found myself saying to my husband as I was struggling with these questions of what I was supposed to do going into this administration, I said, I can't even think clearly because I'm so angry. To me, in that moment and for a long time, anger had existed as this kind of clouding and obstructive force, illegitimate, impeding my ability to think clearly. My husband's response, which was made casually, I think he just wanted his wife to stop spiraling, was simply, maybe you should write about the anger. As soon as he made this very casual suggestion, it was like one of those lenses at the optometrist's office was put over my brain. The simple idea that I didn't have to avoid anger or move it out of the way, but could stare directly at it, suddenly made the world look entirely different. As soon as I permitted myself to consider women's anger seriously and intentionally, a clear thread began to emerge, connecting the history and the contemporary politics that I'd been writing about for years. Suddenly, rage wasn't getting in the way of clear thought, It was informing it. And that's how the book that I published 2 years ago came to be. And I ran home that day and I put down an outline form, so many of the things that I wanted that book to be about. And that outline, the idea for that book actually preceded by several weeks the Women's March, becoming the single biggest one-day political protest in this country's history. It preceded the pressure applied to the Senate, mostly by women callers and postcard writers and protesters, that resulted in the decision not to repeal Obamacare in the spring of 2017. It preceded, as Andrea said, the historic number of women, many of them women of color and first-time candidates, who decided to run for office in 2018, and the historic number of them who won their races. It preceded the teachers, fast food workers, hotel workers, and tech strikes that sprang up around the country in 2018 and 2019 in response to both low wages and sexual harassment. It preceded the hashtag Me Too movement, though not Tarana Burke's Me Too movement of 2006. It preceded the Kavanaugh hearings, Christine Blasey Ford's testimony, the confrontation between Ana Maria Archila and Maria Gallagher, who yelled at then Senator Jeff Flake in the elevator, insisting that he look them in the eye and tell them that their experiences of assault did not matter. It preceded Greta Thunberg standing in front of world leaders and asking, "How dare you?" It preceded the streets of America and the world filling this summer with people proclaiming that Black lives mattered and demanding justice for Breonna Taylor. It preceded the vice presidential candidacy of Kamala Harris and the president characterizing her as a madwoman. The outline I wrote for the book preceded all of that, which I mentioned not to advertise any talent for prognostication. I have no talent for prognostication, but rather to say that when we start looking straight at women's anger, as many of us, I think, have been forced to do in these past 4 years, the world suddenly looks very different. We understand it differently. We have all been trained to think of women's anger, especially anger in response to oppressive power structures, as something loud, vulgar, divisive, destructive, and it can actually be all those things. But what we have been discouraged from considering is that at the very same time, it can be valuable, serious, potent, that anger can connect us to others as well as divide us from them. Who was angry? Rosa Parks was angry. Now, I'm a 45-year-old woman, white woman, raised in a white suburb of Philadelphia. And I was taught in my elementary school about Rosa Parks. But if you, like me, if you were taught about Rosa Parks the way I was, you were probably taught that she was exhausted, stoic, calm, and nonviolent. I was taught that she was a seamstress. All those things are true to a point. It's what we weren't taught about her that is interesting to me, because she wasn't just a seamstress and she was not just exhausted. She was livid. Rosa Parks worked for the NAACP in the Jim Crow South, investigating the gang rapes of Black women by white men and claims of sexual violence levied by white women against Black men, often to justify lynching. Her choice to not give up her seat on that bus in Montgomery in 1955 was not simply an act of polite and admirable stoicism. It was conscious political action born of a lifetime of rage. Yet, the reasoned fury behind it has too rarely been acknowledged, admired, let alone celebrated. Those at the edges of power are not lauded for their fury, and they too often have had their righteous rage completely erased from the record. Why? What did Rosa Parks do? She helped to start a social movement that would transform the nation. See, there's a strategic reason why we have never been trained to see how the expression of real, raw, valid fury at injustice can in fact bring women together, can start movements. There is a reason why we've been told that we have nothing to be angry about. The reason is that angry women are powerful, which is why they are feared, why their communications with each other and the world are discouraged. It has been going on for a very long time. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of a device called the brank. It was also known as a scold's bridle. It was a medieval torture device, and it was used to literally muzzle, to shut the mouths of insubordinate or cranky women. Her head and jaw clamped in a metal cage. Some of the bridles, which were made of iron, included tongue depressors that would be inserted into the women's mouth to discourage them from talking. And some had spikes on the bottom to pierce the tongues of the insubordinate who continue to talk anyway. Now, we may not be literally muzzled anymore, but the men who tell us to smile on the street so that we'll be prettier are actually echoed around us on national political stages. During the 2016 primaries, Joe Scarborough from MSNBC chided Hillary Clinton after a primary win, "Smile, you just had a big night." In 2018, then presidential spokeswoman Sarah Huckabee Sanders said in a news conference about Nancy Pelosi, "I think she should smile a lot more often. She seems to embody bitterness." Another aspersion that a woman who is angry is also mentally unwell is cast every day in popular discourse, so often that we probably don't even understand how completely we absorb it. When Congresswoman Maxine Waters refused to yield in her questioning of Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, announcing that she was reclaiming her time, a moment many of you probably remember, she was described as having a meltdown. She is regularly referred to as unhinged. The conservative Black pastor Darrell Scott has referred to her as a crazy aunt. Just this summer, in the days after Joe Biden selected Kamala Harris as his running mate, President Donald Trump said of her, "You have a sort of mad woman, I call her, because she was so angry, such hatred with Justice Kavanaugh. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. She was the angriest of the group, and they were all angry. These are seriously ill people." Now, the framing doesn't just come from men. Back in 2016, MSNBC's Mika Brzezinski said of Elizabeth Warren, "There's an anger there that's shrill, unmeasured, and almost unhinged." If after this talk you do a Google search on any of the powerful women in politics or public life, especially those who threaten a power structure by insisting on their own reproductive or professional autonomy, by pressing for reforms in the military or the criminal justice system, the banking industry, or by running for office to beat powerful men, you will turn up scores of photos of these women, Kamala Harris and Maxine Waters and Elizabeth Warren and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley. And you'll find these photos of them next to pieces that are meant to be critical. And they always have their mouths open, seemingly in angry dissent. And you're usually making an angry gesture. You'll see this now everywhere you go. The very act of making a loud noise is a sign of their ugly and unnatural personalities. It doesn't even just happen in one political direction. Obviously, my politics are very left, but I have noticed, for example, in articles about Sarah Huckabee Sanders that are critical, there she is with her mouth open, making an angry gesture. The best way to discredit women is to show them opening their mouths with volume and assured force, often in criticism. In the weeks before Brett Kavanaugh was accused of sexual assault, when he was simply being heard by the Senate Judiciary Committee, and women were protesting his nomination, standing in the Senate chamber, yelling about abortion, healthcare, life and death, Senator Orrin Hatch asked for one of them, a woman who had shouted that if healthcare reform were repealed, she would die. Orrin Hatch said, "Get that loud mouth out of here. We should not have to put up with that." Last December, Donald Trump said in a speech about Warren, "She opened that fresh mouth of hers." Open-mouthed anger from women is coded in our minds as ugly, not as admirable or patriotic, not as a sign of strength or moral fortitude, as it might more easily be understood in a powerful white man, raising his voice to make his point, establish the depth of his commitment, or show his drive. And remember here, Kavanaugh's own indignant cry, "I like beer," right? Even as Christine Blasey Ford herself could never have raised her voice without having her testimony disqualified. I've been thinking a lot about the differences in presentation in these past 2 weeks as I've been listening to the confirmation hearings of Amy Coney Barrett. And it's fascinating to me that as a white woman whose judicial record and politics are very firmly in support of a white capitalist patriarchy and not in any way a challenge to it, she has been allowed to be testier, glaring, and getting impatient with some of her questioners, especially Amy Klobuchar and Kamala Harris, than Christine Blasey Ford or Anita Hill 27 years before her, speaking direct challenge to the power structure, would ever have been able to be and still gain the public's approval. But at the same time, Coney Barrett will not wind up snarling and yelling the same way Brett Kavanaugh did. Any woman who raises her voice in challenge to white male authority is read as an inherently destructive and illegitimate force. This past July, after Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was angry about the size of the New York Police Department's $6 billion budget, suggested that a spike in crime in her home city might be tied not to reduced policing, but to the COVID-related economic crisis gripping the nation, her Senate colleague Ted Yoho called her disgusting, a fucking bitch, and out of your freaking mind on the steps of the nation's capital, their workplace. Ocasio-Cortez gave a cogent, steady speech expressing her anger at how she'd been spoken to. But the coverage of that speech in the New York Times presented her as the disruptive force, as quote, unleashing a viral condemnation of sexism, and as a woman who had, quote, upended traditions. Her speech was described as norm-shattering, and the support of her colleagues in Congress as a moment of cultural upheaval. What angry women represent, even when their voices are calm and steady and righteous, is a kind of disorder, a disarray, the making loud that which has long been and that which is perhaps meant to remain silent. The powerful are often driven to quiet the voices of the less powerful if those voices might in any way destabilize their authority. And sometimes that silencing is really literal. In 1964, the civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer began to give her testimony before the Democratic National Convention's Credentials Committee about how she had been arrested and then badly beaten by police after attempting to register voters in Mississippi. The president, Lyndon Johnson, concerned that Hamer's speech would alienate white voters, promptly held an impromptu press conference about nothing to mark the 9-month anniversary of John F. Kennedy's assassination, forcing television news networks to turn away from Hamer's words and instead broadcast his own. Lyndon Johnson knew that Hamer's anger would be meaningful, and he sought to divert America's attention from it. Think about how during the #MeToo movement, one of the great revelations was about the systemic use of NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, which paid harassment claimants in exchange for their silence. I recently read one woman's description about how accepting the terms of her NDA had been like having her tongue cut out, kind of like the brink. Again, the powerful are simply driven to silence the voices of the less powerful if those voices challenge them or threaten to disrupt their grip on power. They're not wrong in this, because we know in this country it is written into our history that political and social anger at injustice, at least when it was expressed by America's original citizen, white men, has been so potent in its chaotic overthrow of order as to give shape to the country in which we now live. Because there is a kind of political rage that we are raised to value, to admire, to fetishize, and understand as formative to this country. Give me liberty or give me death. Live free or die. The men who, in their ire over being taxed and policed without government representation, dumped tea in a harbor, are credited correctly as revolutionaries. They birthed this nation. And in the founding documents of that new nation, those men promptly codified precisely the kinds of inequality at which they themselves had so furiously chafed. They built this country out of the genocide of its native inhabitants, the enslavement of African Americans, the denial of the franchise and full economic, legal, and social parity to women. Now, when we go back and look at the version of history that we're not taught, and there is so much of it that I was not taught, I often find myself having to take 2 steps to correct it. The first is finding the women, many of them very angry for many of the exact same reasons that the men who populate our national lullabies were angry, but whose stories have not been told with reverence, have not been told at all. Now, when I'm in a room and I talk about this, I usually ask the audience how many of them have ever heard of Mum Bet. Now, I can't see how many of you would answer this question in the affirmative. I will tell you that often it's maybe a hand or two, even in crowds of 100 people. I had not heard of Mum Bet, later known as Elizabeth Freeman, until recently. We are not taught about her in schools. But she was a contemporary of the revolutionary founders, and her anger, like theirs, had long-lasting legal and civic consequences. Mum Bet was an enslaved woman working in the home of a revolutionary politician in Massachusetts in the 18th century. She was physically abused, battered by that politician's wife. Mom Bet heard the rhetoric of liberty in that home, and she applied it to her own condition, suing for her freedom. She won her petition, and her case was one of 3 to serve as a basis for the state of Massachusetts' abolition of slavery in 1783. And yet, her story, righteous, furious, consequential, nation-shaping, born of the same anger that led to the birth of this country, is simply not taught in our history books. So that's that first step. You have to root down to find the women but even when you do, even when they're visible, you need to look at the women that we are taught about and ask whether we've been taught about their anger. Because there is a figure, a revolutionary woman who we are taught about as the kind of proto-feminist voice of that period. And again, if I were in the room, I would ask the crowd, and you would probably shout, Abigail Adams. And I would say, what is the thing we're taught that Abigail Adams said? And many of you would say, remember the ladies, which is like the line, the proto-feminist line of the revolutionary period that's in every PBS documentary and like written in script from the letter in which she wrote it to her husband, John Adams, on the wall of museums. And she did write to John Adams in a letter, her husband, in a letter that he should remember the ladies as he and his colleagues put down the roots of what would become this nation's government. Now that, first of all, it's a pretty dismal request, right? That's a low bar. Remember the ladies. But what's interesting is that there is something about that letter that we are not taught, that same letter. In that same letter, Abigail Adams also observed that, quote, all men would be tyrants if they could, which sounds like something somebody could tweet this week. And she also wrote that if the founders did not take women into consideration in their formation of the new nation, quote, women are determined to foment a rebellion. Now, Abigail Adams is a smart woman, and she's very conscious about the language that she's using here. All men would be tyrants if they could. Who is the tyrant in this period? It is King George. What does it mean to say that she and women would be determined to foment a rebellion in a period of revolutionary unrest? She was promising revolution, speaking in the very language of the American Revolution of tyranny and rebellion. So women's anger was being voiced, but it has simply not been transmitted to us as righteous, as important, as formative to the American story. It has, through the passage of history, been erased and ignored. Why? Again, because those in power recognize women's dissenting anger to be as potentially powerful and consequential as the anger of those revolutionary forebears. And the assessment is not wrong. If you look to the start of nearly every movement that has shaken the nation and eventually transformed it, and I am not talking simply of women's movements, the first and second wave of feminism, you can find furious women at their start, but you do have to go back and look for them. Because think of, for example, how we're taught about the labor movement in this country as being about Teamsters, coal miners, air traffic controllers, again, all true. But what are we not taught about it? That some of the very first walkouts, some of the very first labor unions in this country were formed by young women, girls really, working in the textile mines of Lowell and Lawrence, Massachusetts in the 1830s. They too called on the rhetoric of the founding to object to their low wages and unsafe working conditions, claiming, quote, as our fathers resisted unto blood the lordly avarice of the British ministry, so we, their daughters, will never wear the yoke which has been prepared for us. Black washerwomen went on strike in Atlanta in 1881, really just a few years after emancipation, and they brought the economy of their city to an absolute standstill. And it was a 23-year-old immigrant organizer named Clara Lemlich who in 1909 called for a general strike of garment workers in response to dangerous working conditions. That strike of 20,000 people worked. Workers secured new deals with better working conditions with almost all of the shirtwaist manufacturers. Among the shops that didn't agree to their demands was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which burned 2 years later, killing 146 people working inside, most of them women, most of them young immigrant women. 2 other women witnessed that fire, Frances Perkins and Rose Schneiderman, and their view of it and the anger that it provoked in them drove them to change the course of their careers, They would spend the rest of their lives pushing for workplace safety reforms that are still in place today. Many of our gathering places and professional buildings have points of egress, for example, in part because of the work that those women did in response to how angry and furious watching that building burn made them. Women talking to each other about what they're angry about and how they might work together to change it have the ability to pressure governments, remake legislation, determine elections, change systems. In heeding the messages to set anger aside or make it more palatable, in absorbing the lie that there's nothing to be angry about, many women invested in justice and equality have done ourselves and the movement for more liberty a grave disservice. What I would ask those of you who are here today is to think about anger differently. Your own anger and the anger that may be audible around you, but that you have been trained to discount. That anger is not an obstructive thing that you need to clear from your head or convert into something else in order for it to matter or be valid. Rather, it is a fuel that can move us toward each other and sometimes forward into a terrible fight. Repeatedly during these past 4 years, I have been asked of the Women's March, of #MeToo, as we start to examine the swell in support and then the receding support for the Black Lives Matter protests of the summer. Is this a moment or is this a movement? In part, those who ask these questions are craving reassurance that the hard work, the difficult feelings that we're in the midst of, the fear, the pain, the risks that are so evident, are in service of something big and long-lasting, long-term, important. But the question, moment or movement, relies on a binary that doesn't quite track, because movements are made up of moments strung out over months, years, decades, and centuries. They become discernible as movements. They're made to look smooth, contiguous, and coherent only after they've made substantive difference. It was 9 years between Rosa Parks' decision to stay in her bus seat and the passage of the Civil Rights Act. It was more than 80 years between the first 1830s meeting of abolitionists and suffragists and the passage of the 19th Amendment, more than 130 years before the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Now that law, the Voting Rights Act, was gutted in 2013 by the Supreme Court, a body that in 2018 also defended states' rights to purge voter rolls, that last night ruled yet again against methods of expanding the franchise, disproportionately targeting minority voters. We obviously are in the midst of seeing the impact of these decisions all around us. The means of suppression will only be expanded by the federal judiciary that has been shaped by Donald Trump. What that means is that the movement for full democratic enfranchisement in the United States is ongoing more than 2 centuries hence. And maybe it's easy to feel defeated by this reality, especially right now in these weeks. But it is far more worthwhile to instead feel inspired and driven, to know that in resisting and dissenting today, we are playing our parts in a story with long, righteous, and proud roots. The hard fact is that here, toward the end of 2020, no deus ex machina is going to appear to assure us that everything is going to be okay, that those who need protections will receive them, that those whose rights have been compromised will see them restored. What happens is up to us. We determine whether or not we change the world, and our anger on behalf of each other and a more equal future is going to be what keeps us in there fighting. The task, and I should say that this is especially true for some who are new to anger, especially true perhaps for some middle-class white women who have come into this period of resistance anew in the wake of the 2016 election, is to keep going, to not turn back, to not give in to the pressure to renounce or stifle our dissatisfactions and furies at injustice, to not accept the comforts of economic or racial advantage that will always be on offer to those who don't challenge power, and that might permit us to buy the lie that there's nothing really to be angry about anymore. The job for all of us moving forward is, in fact, to stay angry for the rest of our lives. Thank you so much. I would love to answer questions, have a conversation.
Great. I'm really eager to talk to you a bit more about some of the things that you've been raising. So thanks. First, I'd like to encourage our attendees again, feel free to add your questions using the question and answer function that's near the center of your bottom panel. You know, I'd really like to start off actually with one of the places that you concluded in talking about how some populations or some groups may feel as though they are newer to the experience of expressing their anger. Yet in your own work, you often cite thinkers like Audre Lorde with the uses of anger, or Brittany Cooper's eloquent rage that I referred to earlier. And you pay attention to the ways that there are different implications for the expression of anger, not only between men and women, but also among different groups of women. So I wondered if you would elaborate on that a bit more about how people are sometimes taxed differently or interpreted differently in their expressions of anger.
Absolutely. The expression of anger by women in challenge to any form of white patriarchal capitalist authority is treated negatively. But as you say, the framework that's used to discredit that anger shifts depending on which woman is expressing the anger. Black women in particular have been taxed for years, often assumed to be angry, even in instances in which they may not be, or they may not be expressing anger. The attachment of this caricature of Black angry femininity, which has often been used as a sort of either a cartoonish version of angry Black femininity, a kind of neck snapping caricature, or especially if the Black woman is in a position of imagined threat to a power structure, then treated as the Black women who are perceived as angry are treated as monstrous and terrifying. There's the very clear example of that is what happened to Michelle Obama during the 2008 election, in which Michelle Obama, surely one of the warmest figures on a political stage, in that historic election in which her husband was going to be elected president, the first Black president, and she was going to be the first Black first lady ever to live in the White House. After voicing very, very measured, reasonable, factual critique of the nation's history around racism, was depicted by the right-wing press, and then this was taken up by a mainstream press as, you know, Michelle Obama is an angry Black woman. She was pictured on the front of the National Review with her brow furrowed. And, you know, I mean, Michelle Obama is very expressive with her face when she talks. And that's the thing about a lot of those images of women with their mouths open. They could just be saying, they could be saying anything in any tone. But if you capture an image of a woman with her mouth open, it can very easily be depicted as anger. And under headlines, why is Michelle Obama so angry? There was a conservative pundit who began referring to her as Barack's bitter half. So much so that in fact she was caricatured on the front of the New Yorker as a Black militant. So that's an example of how the depiction of angry Black femininity can be deployed as a weapon against Black women in contexts in which they are angry and in contexts in which they are not. Or in which their anger is just completely rational and part of a conversation. So yes, there are absolutely different framings of anger depending on who the angry party is. For white women, there are a lot of enticements, and this is something Brittany Cooper has written about a lot. And actually, Brittany's the person who's probably taught me how to think about the framework within a white capitalist patriarchy, which is fundamentally minority rule, right? With only a small segment of the population whose interests are represented at the top of that power structure. How do you, in a putative democracy, get a majority to continue to support that power structure when it only represents a minority's interests? Well, what you do is you extend privileges and advantages to members of that majority. So toward men across races are extended the advantages of patriarchy that work themselves out sexually, economically, socially, professionally. And to white women are extended the advantages of white supremacy. And that redounds especially powerfully because not only do white women ourselves profit from whiteness, but via our close connections to white men as family members, partners, you know, coworkers, being in community with white men. So there are also advantages to white women who are expected to and who often do uphold white patriarchy. You know, white women, it wasn't just in 2016 when 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump that white women supported conservative politics. That has been the history ever since we've been keeping track. White women support Republican candidates by some majority margin. Because there are protections that are communicated to be on offer for white women in exchange for support of that of a white patriarchal power structure. And so the messages to white women about their anger are different. It's that your anger makes you unattractive and therefore more repellent to the powerful class that you want to have accept you and want you and protect you. You're ugly, you're infantile, you won't be respected, you won't be liked by white men, but you won't be you won't be brought in as powerful. And that's different from the messages that are sent to Black women who are extended neither patriarchal advantage nor the advantages of white supremacy. And Black women's anger is just treated as marginalized and outside and fundamentally illegitimate. And it's not, there's less incentive offered to white women, to Black women, to bottle up their anger, but they are vilified constantly for ever expressing it.
Yeah, you know, actually, as you're talking, we're having a couple of other kind of observations come in too. A couple of viewers have listed other names and examples here, especially thinking about Serena Williams and some of the caricatures about her expression of disappointment or anger about calls in her tennis matches. And then also too, thinking about Claudia Rankine's great work, Citizen, and now Just Us, in which she's really thinking about the ways that that kind of anger has not often been expressed, and the ways that white male privilege, because one of the bases of Just Us is that Rankin does this kind of experiment of going around and asking white men, often on planes, you know, how does it feel to experience certain kinds of privileges, even the privilege to not speak in public or to not smile in public, to have to perform a kind of kindness there. So we really do see those as some other kinds of examples that we could be pointing to.
And the mention of Serena Williams makes me think so much about how anger is used to literally delegitimize people at the margins. And so if you think of the example of that 2018 match at the US Open, in which her anger at a series of calls, which is not at all out of line with the history of tennis, resulted in her being taxed that match, but also delegitimized the win for her opponent, Naomi Osaka. It delegitimized everything about a match because the very natural and rational expression of frustration in a high stress, high level sporting event was deemed to be a violation of norms by like a literal judge, right? A referee on these things who was a white guy. And it wound up delegitimizing the entire exercise, the wins, the losses, the whole thing, simply because the participants were expressing a completely human frustration, you know, that is within the bounds of sports and expressions around sports.
Yeah, you know, and as I see a number of questions coming in, I'd like to organize them in a way, because you were talking about sports here last. And so I'd like to talk about, you know, how this anger can be represented or how it's often reprimanded in public culture, and then we'll move to workplace, and then thinking about more kind of personal interactions. So we have a question here in having us to think about kind of other identity factors that often intersect with whether or not people are entitled to express their anger and what are the repercussions of it. So we have one question saying, can you talk about the difference it makes for single women to understand the power of their righteous anger? So getting you to think about all the single ladies in relationship to Good and Mad. How do we enact solidarity around the various differences that you're naming, like disability and marital status and class, in terms of the ways that we can express and act on our anger?
Okay, so two parts of that question, that last specific question about single women and anger. The first, around the specific tasks around unmarried single women and the expression of anger, goes back to the thing I was saying a few minutes ago about how one of the incentives, and this applies, of course, particularly to hetero women, but because the whole notion of rejection and attractiveness actually also infiltrates all kinds of sexual relationships. I think this also applies more broadly. When what we are told is that our anger makes us unattractive, part of what is being offered in exchange is the thing you're angry about will make you unpalatable, perhaps to the very people. There's a sort of there's an implicit threat around the characterizations of women's anger, and perhaps especially women's anger at sexism, at misogyny, at patriarchy, that is a particular double bind for hetero women. You know, in that they're being told that they're responsible, that they will be rejected by a system that because of their anger at that system, that they're working to punish themselves. The question of how do we build solidarity? I mean, this very, like, everybody here is well acquainted with the incredible interwoven tangle of inequality. And in fact, the tangle is part of what makes it resistant to being uprooted, right? Because we all wind up complicit, implicated within these hierarchies of bias and privilege. So that when we, and that's one of the things that I think is the project in front of all of us, is to recognize how all these different oppressions are connected and how we are all entangled within them. And that's, you know, going back to, and that's why it's so important that we actually express our frustrations. One of the things I write about in the book, one of the things that Brittany writes about, one of the things that we talk about very often is the importance of anger between allies, right? And so that when you see within an effort to uproot, you know, one thread of injustice or oppression, and there is frustration because in that effort you have actually replicated all kinds of other oppressions. One of the challenges in front of us, and one of the biggest things I think that goes toward building solidarity, is to get increasingly comfortable with the discomfort of being told about the hypocrisies and inconsistencies within our own progressive activism. And so, and that's hard, but it's necessary. And it's one of the things that Audre Lorde wrote about so compellingly in her look at the utility and generative nature of anger between allies. And so, you know, I think that often the fear is that the fury between people who are theoretically allied in a fight for more justice would be destructive or divisive. I think we have to really insist on the opposite, as Audre Lorde did so beautifully, which is that discord is actually the generative thing that can take us forward.
Right, right. And, you know, I was thinking about this too, in terms of the ways that even the Marriage Equality Act in some ways has seemed to create fissures that were unexpected. It broadened the umbrella for people who do have marital rights, but it also heightened the ways that we think about single people, and especially single women, as sometimes not falling under that umbrella. And even now, for example, example, as we think about COVID-19 and its disproportionate impact on women and especially caregivers, we don't want for our solutions and our public policies to simply shift that labor onto child-free workers, but rather for us to think all together about what our kind of labor and infrastructures are for supporting families. So, that's a place that we could start to talk maybe about the ways that politics is interacting with workplace policy and kind of how we promote and advance in the workplace. I know, of course, sexual harassment is one place where we often see a kind of flashpoint of thinking about politics and the personal being political in terms of women's ability to progress and advance. We also have a question here from an audience member who says, also too, that kind of anger in the workplace or in your kind of personal presentation comes across as recommendations for communication coaching in the workplace about how you express yourself. So how can we respond to situations in productive ways to be able to move forward professionally instead of having this kind of disciplining of us, especially this person mentions in academia, but I would just broaden that out and say in all of our workplaces.
So starting with the last part of what you just said, this question about expressive anger within workplaces, one of the frustrating things and one of the most difficult things about talking about anger and how, and the sort of punitive reaction that it can engender when anger is expressed in challenge to power, politically within our relationships and within workplaces. Is that there's a yearning for so many. You can feel how much it's been suppressed, and because there's such a yearning. Anytime I speak to a crowd, that question of how do I get my anger across in whatever public context, and often professional context, in which it's completely merited, it's completely righteous. I have learned that I have been paid less, or I have been treated differently, or this is the way that this system is functioning is wrong, and I am angry about it in ways that are entirely rational, and I need the pathway forward to be able to express that anger and make it resonate and get it taken seriously. And one of the frustrations or sadnesses from my point of view is I don't have the answer, because in fact a lot of what I'm doing is descriptive of the double standards and inequities that are in place that work to discount anger. Even correct, righteous, rational, completely, especially righteous, rational anger. And so I can't ever offer expressive advice, because the fact is you could have the sort of solidest case in the world, and this happens every hour of every day in workplaces all around this country. People who have every reasoned, thoughtful approach to what they are infuriated by in their workplace, if they express it loudly, quietly, politely, really, there's like not one answer. It can get ignored. It can get punished. It can land you with a directive to go talk to a communications expert. It gets you labeled difficult, hard to work with. And those are realities that we can't change. Here's the only thing that I can ever say that is actually prescriptive. And it's not about how we express anger, it's how we receive it. Because the only thing that alters those circumstances, that is changing the way that women's anger is received. We can't control the way our anger that we express is going to be received. We can exert some conscious control over how we receive others' anger. And so that's why my advice usually is we need to think about how we hear the anger of our colleagues or our subordinates, whether we are doing the discounting of other people's anger, even as we are ourselves frustrated by the way that our anger is discounted. And so the most prescriptive advice I can offer is to listen differently. It's not any great answer to how we can talk differently. It's how we can listen differently and how we can actually be active in our listening, how we can go out in search of the anger that's around us amongst our peers, again, in our subordinates, if we have them, peers, colleagues, friends, social circles, families. Seek out the anger that may be getting suppressed, or if it's being expressed, is being written off, and think about it differently. Try to take it more seriously. And that's, I think you also raised the contemporary context, what we're seeing happening around us, the ways in which gendered and racial inequity are woven through every aspect of this health and economic crisis, and the sort of untangling of the impact that those inequities are going to have moving decades into the future, around who is dropping out of the workforce, who's doing more work within that workforce, unremunerated, who's experiencing the disproportionate harms within a healthcare system and of an economic crisis. These things are right in front of us right now. They're happening in front of us, and we're going to need to be thinking rigorously, carefully, and painfully about how to unearth the many overlapping injustices that are reshaping our public and our domestic realities right now.
Yeah, yeah. I'd like to ask one more question that, again, we went from public to workplace and now thinking about locally or even personally. One person asked about, how does looking angry for the rest of our lives look in relation to preservation of self? And here I'm reflecting especially on that section of your book where you said, oh my gosh, I wrote this in 4 months. It was really hectic, but on the other hand, I felt more healthy than I had in a long time. You were saying you exercised more and you had better conversations. So how can you maybe talk to others about how self-preservation works alongside an expression of righteous indignation?
So that's such a great question. And there are a couple points I want to make. I do write in there about how my own experience writing this book about anger and taking anger seriously, my own and anger throughout other women's anger throughout history, was this incredibly salubrious experience. But I always take it, and it led me to think more about how the connections we've been taught to make about ill health and teeth grinding, and the connection between anger as a corrosive emotion that does us mental and emotional damage, may actually come from the suppression of the anger. But I can't ever talk about that without acknowledging that my experience of that was like not replicable, because I was being paid to be angry. I was being, right? I had every structural support in place when I had the experience of writing this book and getting to delve into my anger. And yes, it was glorious, right? Anger can be an energy that fills us with clear thought and the freedom of expression, but that's not even replicable in my life. And I'm still paid to talk about anger. And yet, when I'm not in that particular position, that little ecosystem of support where I was being remunerated for this, I still find myself up in the middle of the night, grinding my teeth, ill. And of course, I'm saying this from an extremely privileged white perspective. We know that the physical tolls of the very circumstances of inequality, the very things we're angry about, leave people in ill health, physically, emotionally, right? So I cannot come and tell you that there's some magic, thing about anger that makes us feel good. I can tell you that anger can take many forms. And it doesn't always have to be, like when I say that our job is to be angry for the rest of our lives, it doesn't mean we have to have our teeth bared and be screaming. Anger takes different shapes for all of us. And anger can be the thing that drives us to curiosity, to finding out history that we haven't read before, right? And a version of anger can be reading. A version of anger can be something more active, changing your life course, running for office, devoting yourself to political campaigning. It can be being out there in the streets. It can be working in a different way within your community. It can simply be talking to friends, making new connections between people. And actually, that's the biggest thing I can say about the connection between health and anger is the advice to form networks with people who are angry about the same things, because anger doesn't have to be a miserable feeling. It can lead to joy and connection. So many of the people I spoke to when I was writing this book, and looked back on as I investigated the history of women's anger, so much connection could come from shared fury. and the social and political networks that it could form, and the pleasures of each other's company, and not being isolated. So much about what can be harmful about being filled with anger can stem from that feeling of having to repress it, or even if you're not repressing it, feeling alone in it, feeling isolated, and vilified for it. And so again, anger doesn't have to be just the corrosive and the divisive. It can be the connective and the joyful and the propellant.
I think that those are just great words to think about this as a kind of fuel moving us forward. So thanks again so much for joining us, Rebecca. And I really encourage people to get Big Girls Don't Cry, All the Single Ladies, and Good and Mad, preferably at Simon & Schuster or your favorite women-owned bookstore. And join us again at 1 p.m. as we continue to strategize about how to create feminist futures. Thank you.
Thank you so much.